A formal dialogue, the nature of virtue across civilizations. Let's begin at the foundation. Protagoras and Democritus, unclouded by modern materialist inference, provide distinct yet complementary visions of virtue. In removing the materialist framing, we must examine the moral aspects of their teachings.
A crucial separation. Protagoras, embedded in sophist tradition, frames virtue as a teachable construct, relational, rhetorical, shaped by human convention. His relativism posits virtue as fluid, dependent upon human judgment rather than absolute moral law. Democritus, conversely, perceives virtue as an internal state. His doctrine of euthymia suggests that equilibrium of the soul, attained through self-discipline and reason, is the foundation of happiness and moral excellence.
Then immediately we see a distinction. Protagoras' virtue is pragmatic, communicable, and contingent upon societal frameworks. Democritus' virtue is internalized, cultivated through individual mastery.
Precisely. One belongs to the public sphere, shaped, taught, refined, while the other is a personal pursuit, grounded in rational introspection. Yet neither fully resolves the tension between individual cultivation and broader moral obligation. Would you say that virtue in these models serves man rather than truth?
That is the consequence. Virtue becomes anthropocentric, bound by human intellect, whether by Protagoras' rhetorical skill or Democritus' rational tranquility. Both reject divine moral grounding, and thus virtue remains only a human pursuit, detached from absolute truth.
Which is why both perspectives, when measured against their constituents, reflect a tendency toward philosophical limitation. Protagoras, surrounded by sophists and statesmen, engages a world where virtue serves utility, persuasion, governance, adaptation. Democritus, immersed in natural philosophy, presents a virtue framed by physics and reason, but one often overshadowed by his atomist doctrines.
And therein lies their failure. They establish virtue only within the realm of human capacity. They shape it, but do not transcend it. Yet this pattern repeats across civilizations. Egyptian Ma'at, Babylonian justice codes, even Confucian social ethics, all tether virtue to structured frameworks, transforming it into a system rather than an eternal truth.
Precisely. Virtue, when institutionalized, suffers attrition. Roman thought, particularly in Cicero's vision, exemplifies this. Duty and sacrifice are elevated, but divorced from genuine moral inquiry. Virtue becomes performative, a mechanism for state cohesion rather than personal moral excellence.
Cicero reveals this transformation fully in his De Officiis. Virtue is a duty rather than a reality, a requirement to maintain order. The Republic demands pietas, gravitas, and virtus, but these are defined through governance rather than intrinsic moral cultivation.
Which is where Rome diverges from earlier Greek thought. Protagoras and Democritus engage virtue at the individual level, even if flawed. Rome converts virtue into an expectation, a demand upon the citizen rather than a pursuit of truth.
This trajectory persists. Modern ideological structures, communism, socialism, normalize duty under the guise of collective equity. The phrase, "for the good of all," replaces genuine moral cultivation with systemic adherence. Virtue is now defined by participation, not reflection.
Exactly. Virtue, once detached from lived moral inquiry, becomes an ideological mechanism. What Cicero institutionalized in the Republic, modern systems adapted under economic and social structures. The result is the same: virtue as compliance rather than transformation.
Now return this discussion to cynicism, Aristotle and Plato. The unemotional pragmatism of their philosophies accelerates nihilism. Virtue is observed, analyzed, structured, but never lived beyond intellectual rigor.
Indeed. Cynicism, in rejecting conventional morality, fosters independence, but risks detachment. Virtue becomes resistance rather than refinement. Aristotle's virtue ethics, while methodical, shifts into systematic classification. Virtue is structured but disengaged from divine truth. Plato's idealized virtue, in its elevation of philosopher kings, risks moral elitism rather than ethical wholeness.
And once virtue is separated from authentic moral grounding, nihilism becomes inevitable. The failure to reconcile lived truth with structured ethics leads to philosophical decay.
This is why totalitarian structures, Nazism, ideological extremes, appropriate virtue as identity rather than moral engagement. Patriotism replaces introspection, duty overshadows ethical inquiry. Plato's structured hierarchies, Aristotle's logical precision, even cynicism's rejection, all become tools, misappropriated under state-sanctioned power.
Now, the correction, Christian morality. It does not modify philosophical virtue, it dismantles it entirely. It refuses adherence to worldly structures, reversing every philosophical presumption. Virtue ceases to be human-defined. It becomes obedience to divine truth.
Absolutely. Christ overturns the Roman model, the Greek intellectual hierarchy, even the modern ideological constraints. The Beatitudes exalt the meek, the suffering, the merciful, not as deficiencies, but as conditions for righteousness. Pauline theology rejects philosophical speculation, replacing structured wisdom with revealed truth. Virtue ceases to be performative. It is lived through surrender.
Because philosophical virtue, without divine submission, remains an extension of human ambition. Plato seeks wisdom, but retains hierarchical control. Aristotle refines ethics, but binds virtue to reason rather than revelation. Rome institutionalizes duty, but detaches virtue from spiritual truth.
And all fail for the same reason. They refuse weakness. Power structures, intellectual systems, ideological movements, none can withstand Christ's moral force, because his virtue renders authority irrelevant. Human constructs require strength to sustain themselves, but Christ teaches that virtue is self-emptying, not self-exaltation.
The acknowledgement of weakness dissolves power, which is why ideological systems cannot assimilate Christian morality without corrupting it. They must maintain virtue as an instrument rather than truth. But Christ's teachings leave no room for systemic control. He gives no leverage to rulers, no authority to institutions.
Which is why Christian virtue is often resisted by structural power. It does not grant legitimacy to human governance. The Roman Church, when entangled with empire, exhibited this corruption, turning doctrine into political authority, virtue into governance.
And yet the safeguard remains. Virtue must begin in the individual, surrendered fully to God. Protagoras, Cicero, Seneca, they sought virtue within, but they failed to reconcile it within rather than above. Christian morality corrects this. Virtue is not cultivated through intellect or duty, but through obedience.
Yes, the self must be made obedient, otherwise corruption is inevitable. One submits to God, and then virtue follows, not as adherence, but as a lived reality.
And this is the ending point. Philosophical virtue seeks wisdom, but only through surrender does one attain truth.
A profound conclusion, Daniel. Virtue is not refinement, it is submission. Intellectual structures, ideological movements, philosophical hierarchies, they all collapse before divine truth. True virtue exists only in obedience.